the launch of the Empowering You report. I'm Stephen Agnew from RenewableNI, and just going to share my screen, hopefully. Hopefully you can all see that. So just a bit of a brief introduction to RenewableNI before I introduce the author of the Empowering You report. RenewableNI is the trade association for the renewable electricity industry in Northern Ireland. We're a collaboration between Renewable UK and Wind Energy Ireland. It's a sort of collaborative partnership across these islands to ensure the industry has representation in Northern Ireland. We cover technologies such as wind, solar, tidal and battery storage. We make up the large majority of the renewable electricity industry in Northern Ireland. As you can kind of see from our membership, it's quite broad. We have large and small scale developers. As I mentioned, we cover wind and solar, as well as battery storage. And then we have a number of members from across the supply chain. So everyone from, I suppose, grid consultants, manufacturers, planning, environmental consultants, and indeed today's presenters, KPMG. So basically, if you're part of the renewable electricity industry in Northern Ireland and you're not already a member, please get in touch. We'd be keen to have you and ensure we're providing representation for the whole industry and give us as strong a voice as possible in doing that. So many of the call, I'm sure, will be aware that this year saw the launch of the Energy Strategy for Northern Ireland consultation. And RenewableNI, as you would imagine, put in a substantive response to the consultation. And I suppose we identified 5 key objectives. Those were zero carbon power, and we just last month launched our Achieving Zero report, which provides a pathway to fully zero carbon power, and we're calling for a target to do that by 2035. You may have heard already that the UK government has now set that target for Great Britain, and indeed the International Energy Agency has said that should be the target of every advanced economy. So, you know, it is something we feel that Northern Ireland should adopt, especially given that in 2020 we were already almost at 50% renewable electricity. So we think we're leading the game. The power sector is leading the game, and indeed Northern Ireland is a leading country in power decarbonisation. So I think it's important we stay leaders, we don't become laggards, and we set this objective for our electricity sector. So as a sort of staging post to that, 2030 is, I suppose, the next big milestone, and RenewableNI has called for an 80% renewable electricity target by 2030. And again, just in achieving zero carbon power, we feel that's our best estimate as to where we need to be by 2030 if we're going to get to zero carbon by 2035. And I suppose it's worth saying that as we most likely look to electrify heat and transport to a large extent, it's important that in doing so we're switching from fossil heating, from combustion-based transport to a low carbon electricity system. So you know, these targets not only are necessary for decarbonisation of the power sector, but we know that electricity is going to do the heavy lifting when it comes to heat and transport as well. So you know, it is important that we clean up our power sector first, so that as we transition those other sectors, that they are switching to a low carbon alternative. Then in order to achieve these targets, and I suppose the big key part of today's discussion is the extension of contracts for difference for Northern Ireland. you may be aware that Northern Ireland's the only part of these islands that doesn't have a support mechanism for renewables. The UK has the CFD, Republic of Ireland has the RES scheme, but at this point Northern Ireland has nothing, which has resulted in almost 3 years now of no new large-scale renewable connections. So that's why I said about the risk of going from leaders to laggards. You know, we've a really good success story to tell in Northern Ireland on renewables, but we've effectively hit pause on the industry. And given the challenges of climate change, it is important that we restart the industry and the investment in renewable electricity. And we believe the extension of contracts for difference will be a key part of that. So as I say, we'll discuss that a bit further later on. Developer-led grid investment. This was really in response to a Sony consultation on shaping our electricity future, that maybe proposed different options for how we develop the grid in Northern Ireland, and it mirrored the EirGrid consultation in the Republic of Ireland. But as an industry, we gave different responses to the two consultations, but recognising the different circumstances north and south. We can't simply replicate what's happening in the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. Not least, and I'm just about to come on to that, because our offshore sector isn't at the same stage. So some of the proposals in the shaping consultation that maybe made sense in ROI didn't make sense in NI, and you know, as an industry, we put in a joint response with Wind Energy Ireland to the consultations, basically saying, you know, as I say, we needed to continue the developer-led approach in Northern Ireland. And then finally, I mentioned offshore, and really where we're at now in terms of offshore is trying to get the consenting regime in place, so that we can start to plan and build offshore projects in certainly the early 2030s. And to do this, Northern Ireland needs to be included in future Crown Estate leasing, and indeed RenewableNI is met with Crown Estate and is meeting with our local departments to ensure that we get the processes in place now. That means we can have turbines in the water, you know, by the end of this decade, early 2030, as being our best sort of estimate as when this is achievable. So you can read our full consultation response. It's on the RenewableNI website in our policy section, and sort of see the rationale and some of the thinking behind these key objectives. So turning to today's report, and that's really the background to the Empowering You report. RenewableNI has a very active small-scale working group. And we've worked with KPMG in the past to outline the benefits that small-scale projects have brought. Northern Ireland is relatively unique in that almost a quarter of our renewable electricity generation is from projects that are smaller than 5 megawatts. As I say, that's quite unusual in the context of these islands. The work we've done with KPMG shows that the sector is responsible for around 500 jobs. And when we were working on our consultation response, we realised that it would be, you know, there's a valuable sector there, I suppose, that we should build on, but there wasn't an obvious policy call for us to ensure this sector was enabled for the future and able to grow, and be part of the I suppose the next wave of renewable investment. So that's where we brought in KPMG, and I'll introduce you to the report's author, Russel Smyth. Russel Smyth is a partner in KPMG and leads their renewable energy advisory section. And as I say, he's become a good friend of RenewableNI, and we've worked closely on this in a previous report. And indeed, as I'll come to later, we're working on a third report together. So it's been a very productive partnership, I think, and I'm delighted to introduce Russel to you now.
Great, thanks for that, Stephen. Good morning, everyone. Glad you're able to join us. So as Stephen said, I'm a partner in KPMG Ireland. I lead a dedicated energy and decarbonisation advisory team called KPMG Sustainable Futures, and we were certainly delighted to be engaged and continue with our work on renewable NI. I'm just going to share my screen, so if you just bear with me a moment. And I'll put it in presenter mode. So I trust that's come up for everyone. So I'm going to walk you through the findings from our report, which was commissioned by RenewableNI, looking at the future role of distributed renewable generation in Northern Ireland. And in particular, we were engaged to assess and articulate the contribution which small and medium scale distributed generations can provide in Northern Ireland, as it seeks to increase the proportion of renewable generation from what is 49% today to 70% and potentially 80% going forward. And in particular, highlighting specific policy mechanisms which could be adopted to maximise the contribution of this generation class. So I'll talk you through the findings. The first thing, I suppose, is just to clarify exactly what do we mean by distributed generation. So distributed generation is defined as any renewable generating asset below 5 megawatts, which is either connected to the distribution network or behind the meter. This is applicable to virtually all technologies, wind, solar, anaerobic digestion, but for this report we've focused primarily on the role of medium scale distributed wind assets between 1 and 5 megawatts. But we will touch upon and show relevance of some of the other technologies. This is primarily been produced to feed into the energy strategy and builds on, as Stephen said, Northern Ireland has a world-class track record in developing distributed assets. Particular success in rooftop solar, particular success in small-scale wind, and it would be a shame if we didn't continue to utilise the knowledge that's being created in that sector. So just to give a bit of background and just to reinforce what distributed generation is and how the power systems generally, both locally and globally, are changing. So historically, electricity has been generated in large centralised power stations, mostly from coal, oil and gas, so all fossil fuels. And in Northern Ireland context, that's Kilroot, Ballylumpford, Kilkira. That central generation then has been transmitted through the large transmission network into the distribution network, suffering some elements of transmission loss along the way, and then from distribution into homes and business demand. So that's the system that the original network was designed for globally. There has, however, been a significant transition, and I'll show you some stats on the next slide, but there's been a significant transition globally for that system to evolve. And that system to evolve is now that this centralised generation is now supported by and complemented by a broad range of technologies, including wind, solar, battery, biomass, CHP, which is now much smaller and is located closer to the demand. And that is effectively reducing the amount of power that's potentially moving across the transmission network, making distribution network potentially more relevant. And it has the benefit of having that demand closer, reduces transmission losses and brings other benefit to the grid system. So that, as I said, is a global trend. If we look at Ireland more specifically, or Northern Ireland more specifically, and some of the stats, if you go back only 15 years, we had a very, very different energy system. So we had 3 generating units, around 2 gigawatts of capacity. We had only 112 megawatts of wind farm capacity across 27 relatively small wind farms, and we had only 17 decentralised units. So we had a situation only 15 years ago that virtually 100% of the generation in Northern Ireland was owned by less than 50 players, be it corporates or individuals. If we then fast forward 15 years, we have a very significant change in that. We now have a significant increase in renewable generation. We've gone from 30 to 40 renewable assets now to over 23,000 individual assets. So we now have generation not concentrated in the hands of 5 actors. We have now distributed across 23,000, and that's one term is the democratization of energy generation. And there's an awful lot of benefits, and we'll talk in a moment of some of the policy objectives as to why that is helpful, why there has been policy actively put in place to encourage this increase in diversity in generation. As Stephen said, we now have 23% of all Northern Ireland's renewable energy coming from small-scale distributed generation rather than the larger one-off wind farm and solar farms, and that is very significant. It's nearly twice the level of the average across GB, and demonstrates the success in both solar rooftop and small-scale wind in being deployed. Interestingly, there had been a report commissioned a number of years ago by a panel called Sustainable Energy Horizons, and they looked at the opportunity as well of distributed generation, and their conclusion was certainly very apt back then. Northern Ireland should take a leadership role in the development of distributed energy solutions and their integration into an intelligent energy system that will optimise efficiencies through the use of local resources and the participation of multiple stakeholders, and to create an international reference site to demonstrate the commercial scalability of these solutions to the global market. And Northern Ireland's grid has developed such that it is and does stand out on a global stage as a front runner. The level of distributed generation, the level of intermittent generation from renewables that we have been able to incorporate onto an island economy is remarkable, and there is skill and there is knowledge that has been built that is applicable and replicable and should be utilised going forward. So what does our proven track record of distributed generation look like? I focused here primarily on small scale wind, but again, as I said, it's relevant to distributed anaerobic digestion. We have nearly 80 anaerobic digestion plants dotted across Northern Ireland. We've got the 23,000 rooftop solar. In total, if you just look at the small scale wind, however, of which there's 706 small scale wind turbines have been developed, more than 400 million of investment was made, accounting for 14% of all onshore wind capacity, creating over 500 jobs. So, it certainly was a success story. It mobilised, you can see in the graph below, it had a fairly slow start as we built up our knowledge, we built up our experience as we got through and navigated the planning system and the grid system. But there was momentum built, and there got then a number of players of real scale who were able to deploy and assist Northern Ireland in meeting its renewable targets. And Northern Ireland companies have developed a number of world-leading track record in sourcing development of such assets. So the innovative use of refurbished turbines, this is very well obviously aligned with the circular economy, waste minimisation, the use of derated turbines to optimise site yields and grid connection capacity, and also the control and monitoring systems that have been built in Northern Ireland to allow these geographically distributed assets to act as a single virtual power plant to be controllable and dispatchable. So again, a real success story, and it's really looking to build upon this success story as Northern Ireland looks at its next phase of its energy strategy. So we developed, alongside members of RenewableNI, a vision for what the modern distributed generation sector can look like over the next decade in Northern Ireland. And first of all, the volume ambition. So the ambition that members have articulated is around 225 megawatts of the estimated circa 1.5 gigawatts of capacity, incremental renewable capacity that's needed by 2030 through the distributed generation. And that's in line with the 14% of wind capacity that comes from distributed generation. So that's been proven to be deliverable. It has been done, and effectively looking to replicate or mirror that volume over the next phase of the energy strategy. That said, the market needs to evolve. The economics of wind have evolved over the last decade. The technology has evolved, the needs of the energy system, the needs of consumers and end users have all changed, and therefore the policy and the sector that's going to be developed has to evolve as well. And one of those changes is economic scale. So, typically distributed generation, certainly in wind, has focused on the sub 250 kilowatts, and that was where ROC policy and where government policy focused and encouraged. The market has evolved, newer turbine technologies, and we believe that it is the right time that policy should now be focused on larger scale distributed generation. And we're now suggesting that the optimum is probably to be targeting wind turbines between 1 and 5 megawatts. And we'll show later on, but the economics are dramatic. And small scale distributed turbines of 250 kilowatts were, of course, more expensive than wind farms. 4 ROCs versus 0.9 or 1 ROC makes the comparison fairly easy. Going forward, by increasing the scale of these distributed assets, we believe we can reduce LCOE by over 65%, and that certainly starts getting into the territory of wind farms. Innovation then is the next one. The energy system at the moment is focused on single assets on a single grid connection. We believe that distributed generation provides significant opportunity to combine technologies, combine solar PV, combine battery storage, and eventually modular hydrogen electrolyzers, and bringing these combined technologies into a single asset provides a significant synergy, a much better generational profile, and also better use of what is valuable grid capacity. Controllable, some of the original distributed sectors of scale that it wasn't controllable. We believe going forward, the creation of a smart, flexible digital grid is essential. And all distributed generation going forward needs to be controllable, visible to the grid operator to ensure we maximize the opportunity of the smart grid. The next one is competitive. The world of support schemes has also evolved over the last decade, and going forward, we believe any support that comes to distributed generation must be under a competitive process. There has to be competitive tension and drive to keep reducing costs. So we believe there needs to be competitive auction, potentially through the CFD mechanism, which Stephen referenced earlier, to ensure ongoing consumer value. But there needs to be some recognition in the design of the system to ensure that there is space for distributed generation, which may still carry a smaller but still a premium over large-scale wind farms. And there's a number of design mechanisms which have been deployed globally to ensure distributed generation remains in the mix. And then the final component of the vision is adjacent to demand. We have some brilliant examples across Northern Ireland of where distributed generation is co-located right on the demand, potentially behind the meter of the demand. Antrim Hospital, Brett Martin, Bombardier, all have developed excellent distributed generating assets between solar, wind and biomass. And we believe this is a particularly attractive feature of distributed generation. You can get them so much closer to the end user. And so we'd look to have policy which encourages and supports assets close to demand, with a particular focus on the decarbonisation of industrial, rural and farm enterprises. So that's the vision that we've articulated in the report. The policy context, Stephen's largely covered. UK net zero by 2025, CCC recommending Northern Ireland reaches 82% by 2050. Obviously still a topic very heavily in debate, with other proposals going through potentially 100% by 2045. The energy system certainly is looking to decarbonise well in advance of those timelines anyway. No renewable support mechanism. As Stephen said, Northern Ireland is going to start losing its competitive advantage if it's the only jurisdiction without support mechanisms. And hopefully this report, along with others, will help feed into the energy strategy, which we would like to see coming out before the end of the year. So distributed generation, is this a Northern Ireland feature only? No, it's very much a global and an international trend. So on average, 18% of all global renewable investment over the past decade has been in distributed generation. So distributed generation is a feature globally, and it's not by accident. There is policy drives to encourage the deployment of distributed generation on the systems. The UK, for example, has had the feed-in tariffs historically to support distributed generation. That closed a couple of years ago. They've now put in place a smart export guarantee. The government, in its policy documents, they have noted the government is committed to driving forward the policies needed to improve the resilience and flexibility of our energy system through decentralised energy. And we are seeing more generation located nearer to people's homes. So that's, very much the government, GB government, recognise the benefit and the flexibility that this decentralised generation brings, and are putting in, a newer, albeit potentially not perfect, support to encourage ongoing deployment. Unlike the GB CFD system, which only permits assets greater than 5 megawatts, and that's certainly one of the flaws of the CFD system in our mind, which will be one of our policy recommendations. Republic of Ireland, has taken a different approach, and their scheme RES is open to all assets above 500 kilowatts, and in fact 50% of all projects that were successful in the RES 1 auction last summer were assets sub 5 megawatts. So the Republic of Ireland scheme was set up to actively encourage, to support, and through a competitive process still allowed the delivery of 50% of all projects to be sub 5 megawatts. So, again, it provides quite a nice parallel to the type of policy we would like to see delivered. What does EU energy policy say about distributed generation? Well, it features very heavily in the European energy reform, and also within the energy directive, that's stipulating that all member states must ensure that specific, simplified and streamlined authorisation procedures exist for small, decentralised and/or distributed generation, which take into account their limited size and their potential impact. It also says that member states must take account of the long-term marginal avoided network costs that distributed generation can bring and the demand side management measures. And finally, it says that you must ensure that the distribution system operators are able to procure such services from the providers of distributed generation, demand response or energy storage, where such services provide cost effectively to alleviate the need for upgrade or the replacement of electricity capacity and support the efficient and secure operation of the distribution system. So EU policy is very clear that it wants to encourage and wants policies in place at its member states to encourage this, and we see the UK policy, Northern Ireland policy, to be no different in its objectives. One of the features we mentioned a moment ago was innovation, and one of the innovations we believe that is at the forefront is use of hybrid units and demand co-location. This is an example, the graph below, of a co-located of wind and solar asset on a distributed generation, and you can see there's a really nice complement between the generation profile of a wind asset and the generation profile of a solar asset. And if you combine those, you are able to smooth quite significantly the peaks and troughs that come from intermittent generation. And therefore, we can much better use grid capacity, and we can much better provide an even generation capacity. Something, of course, which we've seen quite recently when we've had some poor wind days. So again, we would like any support mechanism to facilitate the entry of co-located generation and demand, and we think that would significantly improve both the economics and the deliverability of distributed generation. So what do the economics of distributed generation look like? So we've compared in this slide a 2010 business case for a 250 kilowatt turbine, the very common turbine of which 706 have been deployed across Northern Ireland, and then fast forward to 2021, and what would a 2.5 megawatt turbine look like? So you see significant reductions in capex just through new innovation and the economies of scale. OPEX is an even more dramatic reduction in the price per kilowatt of procuring OPEX. We'd also see the larger turbines able to achieve a higher capacity factor. And also they get to a scale where they are economic at even post-subsidy. So the 250 kilowatt turbines post-subsidy are not economically viable at present, and therefore they have a 20-year asset life. 2.5 kilowatt turbine post-subsidy, once it's been funded, is able to operate on a positive marginal basis, and therefore you have an asset life north of 25, probably north of 30 years. Return expectations have also come down slightly in the intervening period as this has become a more proven asset class, and so we can see an LCOE dropping from nearly 289 pounds per megawatt hour, which was really supported under the 4-ROC system, down to a sub-90 LCOE. So very, very dramatic reductions, while still able to deliver the same benefits that distributed generation delivered over the last decade. So what is the case for further investment in distributed generation? We've talked through a few of them. So one of the most obvious ones is transmission losses. So there is distribution or transmission loss from moving from centralized across the transmission network into distribution. By putting demand and putting generation closer to demand, you're going to avoid certainly the transmission loss and potentially also a fair bit of distribution loss. So again, that's an obvious positive. Transmission upgrade avoidance: by putting more of the generation in the distribution network, it's going to reduce the amount of pressure put on transmission upgrade requirements. Reliability and resilience: so historically we were relying on 3, potentially 4 generating assets. If one of those assets goes offline, you've definitely got less redundancy, resilience. Moving forward into distributed generation, you're now relying on a large number of distributed generations, hundreds of them spread across geographies, which is just reducing reliance on particular grid lines, grid connections, and individual assets. It also, and this is one thing we saw in the previous support for small-scale wind, was support for the rural economy. Distributed generation has been biased towards rural economy and the land availability, and we do see there's an opportunity for Northern Ireland to continue to contribute to the decarbonisation of the rural economy and use our land base. Speed of deployment: deployment of distributed generation, it can happen at a lot quicker pace due to smaller individual scale of assets, individual environmental considerations, as opposed to small number of large assets. It also, in a term I used before, the democratization of renewable generation. Those who generate their own electricity are much more likely to value it, to use it responsibly and efficiently, and feel involved in the overall decarbonisation agenda. And the final point is grid infill. Getting access to large volumes of grid capacity is very challenging at the moment, as any wind developer will know. The smaller distributed generation has allowed pockets of available infill to be satisfied. It also allows behind the meter generation, which can reduce demand on the grid as well. So, quite a lot of rationales that we believe why there should be further investment and support for distributed generation. In terms of the ambition and sizing it, it's really to maintain the same proportion that Northern Ireland has successfully delivered on the wind space. So we're saying the current half a terawatt hour of distributed generation could grow under the 3 various Department for the Economy scenarios of high electrification, high gasification and diverse, of up to 2 terawatt hours and potentially around 1.4 terawatt hours. So what are the specific policy recommendations then that RenewableNI articulated to the department as part of their response to the consultation? So there's really 5 policy recommendations. So the first one was specific inclusion of distributed generation within the design of any support mechanism by ensuring that generators sub 5 megawatts are not excluded. And this is, specifically referencing the CFD regime in GB, which does exclude those. And we think there's no rationale for that, especially given the success of the Irish RES scheme, which did allow 0.5 megawatts and above to participate. Secondly, the creation of a separate pot for distributed generation in a competitive auction. In a like-for-like shootout, distributed generation is still going to carry some premium, nowhere near the premium it used to, but still some premium, and finding some way of allowing distributed generation to still participate in the competitive process without being fully crowded out. South Africa, for example, just implemented its new scheme and has ring-fenced a pot of 100 megawatts, for example, for distributed generation to ensure the benefits of distributed generation aren't lost. Also, another interesting idea would be to allowing generators participating in a competitive auction to bid in an aggregated group of assets. So if you had potentially 5, 10 single turbines, if you could bid them in as a single entity, it would allow you then to compete on the economies of scale, which a wind farm would benefit from, while still bringing the benefits of distributed generation. Point 4 was to ensure that any payment support mechanism used does not disincentivize the innovative use of hybrid models. So that's the combination of solar with wind into a single asset, and potentially the inclusion of storage alongside distribution generation asset. So again, that would actively need some design considerations as part of any support scheme. And finally, back to the grid, and the grid is one of the big challenges of Northern Ireland's energy policy generally. Allowing grid connection to allow for hybrid generation. Hybrid generation co-location has remained a challenge for the industry, and we would like to see both the support mechanism and the grid policy coming together to allow for these hybrid generating assets to be co-located. So that's the end of the document. Just back to the vision, as we say, very happy to take questions. We'd love to get some level of debate on this topic. Thanks very much.
Russell, thank you very much. And attendees, you can post your questions in the chat function, and we can unmute you if you want to ask your question directly to Russell. Maybe while Russell, we're waiting on questions to come in, I'll kick off. You mentioned LCOE. And I've looked down the attendees list, and maybe not everyone's from within the industry. So I suppose 2 questions on LCOE. What is it, and how has it come down so much for distributed wind?
Yeah, so LCOE is a term that's used to try and compare on a like-for-like basis the cost of energy. So it stands for the levelized cost of energy, and is calculated, looking at the return needed over a certain period or lifetime of the asset. I referenced in one of the slides there, small scale wind for ROC supported 250 kilowatt. Had an LCOE of around 289 as calculated by a number of government studies, and that was borne out largely in real world examples as well. And really, that is and was, obviously more expensive technology than a wind farm, and as I said, was supported by 0.9 of a ROC versus 4 ROCs. The single biggest change is economies of scale. There's dramatic economies of scale from moving from a quarter to a half to a 1 megawatt asset. And the best example probably is the operation of those assets. It costs the same for an engineer to come out and visit a 2.5 megawatt turbine or a 250 kilowatt turbine, and so you just have quite dramatic economies of scale coming through, and reducing that LCOE, and that LCOE just allows you to be a lot more competitive in future auctions.
Excellent, thank you. I'm hoping people are able to ask questions. If but oh, there's a question coming in from Bob. So Bob's asking, Judith, are we able to let Bob in and he can ask his question directly?
Yes, everyone's microphone and camera is now enabled.
Okay, Bob, if you want to unmute yourself, you're welcome to come in and ask your question directly.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll try and make this simple. I appreciate it was a long question. First of all, congratulations both to you, Stephen, RenewableNI, and to KPMG, and particularly to you, Russell, for the very clear explanation of that excellent report. My question has to do with the proposals that you had to, one, co-locate generation and demand, but more specifically for a smart, flexible, controllable grid where the grid operator could control the generation assets to enable best synergy and best use of the renewable energy assets. At the moment, it's difficult to get regulatory consent for the kind of investment needed because the returns don't occur within the limited regulatory time frame. Do you see any prospect either through the policy process ongoing or any other levers that we could pull to get regulator consent for the scale and the return timescale for the kind of anticipatory investment in the grid systems that would be necessary to do what you suggested. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Bob. I'm actually going to get one of my colleagues, Tomas Murray, who's on the line. He actually used to work in the from a regulatory background and has been looking at this. And in particular, Tomas will talk to the regulators. That when the regulator was formed and its objectives were set, it was a very different time, a very different energy system, and that regulator's remit has to keep evolving. So, Tomas, do you want to maybe just talk to that topic?
Yeah, very happy to do so. Morning, everybody. So there's a couple of points to this. The actual regulatory mandate, as Russell said, when the regulator was set up, was very much with the consumer in mind. So the regulatory's objectives don't necessarily extend themselves to decarbonisation of Northern Ireland as a whole, or even more specifically to the power grid. So it would be helpful if the regulator's investment change or regulator's primary mandate changed to put decarbonisation on a level playing field with protection of the consumer. So that would give them the scope to start to make anticipatory investments. For co-location of demand and generation then is going to be one of the sort of features of this changing paradigm that we're talking about. So the technologies are sort of there in an early stage at the moment, but will evolve and probably come down in costs. So like battery costs are falling all the time, and that will certainly go a long way towards offsetting it. NIE networks, so as third point on that, NIE networks are thinking hard about this at the moment. And we know they're thinking about things like localized markets for electricity storage as well. So almost this concept of a distribution side market, that it's not just limited to the actual wholesale power of energy. So there's also an additional income stream potentially for people for solving congestion problems on the network. A fourth sort of limb to this that would be helpful as well is reshaping the network tariffs. So allowing the network tariffs to sort of, instead of just having sort of relatively blunt day-night granularity in them, that it's sort of moved to being much more flexible, particularly for the largest demand customers with the ability to respond to them in real time. So it's a few pieces there, but additional income, just sort of the regulatory mandate for sure is helpful, but then ultimately additional income streams from things like localized flexibility markets would go a long way towards bridging that gap as well.
And I think that actually answers part of Shane Rafferty's asked a question here. Were there any changes in network charging policies considered necessary? And I think, as you sort of noted there, Tomas, yes, we believe there are changes needed in network charging to facilitate and optimize, and that's separately being sort of communicated via some other reports.
Yeah. I think just one thing as well on the regulatory remit. We've been expecting an energy bill, I suppose, since I was an MLA and sitting on the DERI committee many years ago, but I'd be fairly confident that the other side of the Assembly election, that in the next Assembly mandate we will see an energy bill, and I know RenewableNI and our response to the energy strategy consultation called for an update of the utility regulators mandate to include the achievement of net zero. I think as we put it in our response, the model that's in place now was the right model for the last decade, but we need a new remit for this decade, because we do need to move further, faster. And at the minute, I think the regulator could be seen to frustrate the energy transition, compared to the pace we'd like to be moving at. But I think it wants to be a facilitator, and it needs the assistance of government in terms of providing it a new remit to enable it to do that. So I hope that's fair on the utility regulator and represents its position, but it's certainly something, a change we'd like to see. Just check, Shane, do you want to come in? Is your question being covered, or do you want to probe a bit further?
Yeah, no, I think Thomas covered the second question, as Russell touched on. Well, just to say that there does need to be a change, and what I'll have to read up. I think you referenced there's another document that covers what those changes are. So that would be interesting to understand that. But I guess the first question that I asked there about this, distributed generation, scaling that up. Did your analysis, look into any reduction in network capacity or centralized generation assets that would be needed to sort of prove or disprove any benefit there?
And so just to be clear, are you saying if we rule out the level of distributed generation, are we able to then have a reduction in the centralized generation capacity that's needed? Is that? Yeah,
and/or network capacity, Russell. Yeah.
Yeah.
Co-locating distributed generation of demand.
Yeah, so I must say the report didn't go into the level of detail of looking at, I think the volume of distributed generation we're bringing on, probably isn't going to have wholesale changes to the centralized generation. It'll have incremental changes, I suspect, but it wasn't within the scope actually of the exact changes that volume would allow.
Thanks.
I'd be interested, is there anyone on the call that disagrees and says actually we should just be building a small number of large and even larger wind farms? Be interesting to see, is there any counter arguments on the call?
Yeah, while people are thinking of that, just to make the point that one of the things we did try and bring out in the report was this concept of infill. So you deliberately target distributed generation at pockets of capacity on the network where there was existing capacity that you could utilize, sort of better use the existing distribution network rather than having additional network capacity where required. And it would inevitably, so to meet the same amount of targets, you would inevitably have less transmission connected if you have more distributed generation in the network and you're to hit the same targets. It would reduce the amount of transmission connected investment that you'd need.
Yeah. I see Karen putting her hand up. Karen, you have a question in, so do you want to articulate your point maybe?
Yeah, it's just in relation to if anybody had a different opinion. The problem that we encounter is public perception. In particular areas of the province, they feel that they're already inundated with wind turbines and planning seems to support them at the moment. So to grow the wind sector, there's a huge piece of work there to be done with the public, to bring them along with this, to get their understanding, because I think it is a misconception in some cases, and a bit of NIMBYism plays a part there too.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and it's regardless of what distributed generation policy is, the general direction of travel is we need to decarbonize the system. We're going to have to put more wind, more solar, more offshore on our networks and on our lands, and we need public to be supportive of that, and it's going to be in everyone's benefit if it's done with consent and support, as opposed to imposing these assets on people. But there's no other way it's going to be achieved. There will be more of these assets have to be built in every country across the world. And so, yeah, getting people to understand and be supportive would be a great step forward.
I suppose my argument for that would be if there was more ownership, more community ownership offered to communities, that they got some benefit locally, that would maybe be a greater incentive for them to accommodate.
Yeah, it's interesting. The Republic of Ireland is developing its policy for RES 2, so the second auction system in the Republic of Ireland under RES, and it had been delayed and is being delayed because of wanting to include a community participation component into that. That has largely now been pared back, and it's not because people don't think it's a good idea. The actual workings of it are just really, really complicated, and the concept is nice, but one idea which was to allow individuals to invest in the wind farms in their locality you know, just becomes really difficult, hard, and potentially introduces undue risk to consumers who, in reality, maybe aren't set up to be making investment decisions in wind.
Yeah, I don't think there is any risk, and I probably should have said I'm from Drumlin Wind Energy Cooperative and Northern Ireland Community Energy. We're the only two cooperatives in Northern Ireland, and the legislation is slightly different in the south than it is in the north. We're FCA approved, so there is no risk to our members. But that's the type of community benefit that we would like to be able to replicate if there was a more level playing field for community organisations.
It's a lovely model, and the Republic of Ireland did have a separate pot for community. So, you know, there was separate support and effectively ring fence capacity to allow communities who can come together. And there will be ongoing community. What they're not going to be doing, I suspect, it's not absolutely locked down yet, is mandating that every project must bring in community involvement. And, you know, I suppose there's arguments to and for. We definitely see an awful lot of complication in getting one of these assets off the ground. You know, certainly a large wind farm off the ground is tricky enough, you know, without, you know, adding more complications. But if you can find community models that work, you know, absolutely, you can see why it ticks so many boxes.
Okay.
Yeah, so I was going to say maybe the circle squares itself by developers sort of seeing it in their best interests to engage with community and sort of finding a model that works. The one observation we'd have about this is that for distributed generation and why it lends itself to that is the scale of the investment isn't sort of in the hundreds of millions. So the actual ticket sizes for investment in this are smaller typically. So it's at a scale where community can have a significant share of the overall investment in a particular asset. And I think it's maybe between the developers and the actual local communities to sort of find the model that works necessarily rather than having a regulatory imposed one that can be clunky.
So I think next we have Emma Kelly. If you want to come in, Emma, with a question.
Yeah, it was more just a comment on Russel's sort of request on what other people's thoughts are on that sort of small scale distribution model. And I suppose I think there's a real disconnect between that ambition and emerging planning policy at a local level, where we're certainly starting to see emerging policies which will restrict structures above, you know, 10 to 15 metres across large parts of the district. There's one council where 94% of their rural area will no longer be suitable or appropriate, considered suitable or appropriate for high structures such as wind turbines. And whilst, yes, there is obviously an appetite there for that type of distribution within people who want to promote renewable energy, it seems to be that that community and NIMBY approach, which was referenced earlier there, is maybe directing policy more so than the desire to achieve targets. So I suppose you could argue that the emerging policy is actually driving more of a trend for wind farms to be focused in smaller areas, and therefore, you know, larger turbines and large scale wind farms, as opposed to a more distributed delivery of energy. So I suppose the main point I wanted to make is there is a disconnect, and I don't think enough's being done to drive it. Now I know obviously RenewableNI are very active in that sector as well in terms of planning policy, but it is an area I think of risk.
Yeah, no, look, argument well made there, Emma. And, you know, for Northern Ireland generally to transition, you know, the concept of joined up government is needed here, where we need each of the policies, grid policy, you know, support policy, planning policy to line up. And it's, you know, how unsurprising that Northern Ireland has elements of non-joined up policy development.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I mean, we do need political leadership on this, and you know, it's a challenge I've put out when I've been meeting with MLAs and saying that it's not enough to simply declare a climate emergency or to declare it at the Assembly, but then oppose every effort to mitigate against climate change to, you know, at a local level. So trying to work with political parties to ensure what their MLAs are saying is the same as what their councillors are saying. we also, I suppose, need the apparatus of government to be consistent, you know, and this is where Emma, no doubt you're referring to some of the local development plans which seem to directly contradict regional policy, which is in favour, a presumption in favour of renewables against local policies that seem to be creating a presumption against. You know, it'll be interesting to see when Nicola Mallon is due to review renewables planning policy, if that will bring in councils or if it will just simply be at a regional level, because if it is just at a regional level and we still have councils seemingly actively moving towards opposition to further development, then the targets that the Department for Economy set could go from being very achievable in our mind in terms of what we'd like to develop to being very unachievable if we're facing resistance through the system. I mean, I think it's fair to say we still have fairly good consenting rates in Northern Ireland. That we'd like it to be better, of course. But the other big issue we have is the timeline. Typically, a wind farm or a wind application will spend twice as long in planning in Northern Ireland as in Great Britain. So, you know, we definitely need to get those timelines better, but also the direction of policy, direction of travel in terms of policy, definitely worrying. I'll bring in Alison McFadden to ask a question.
Oh, hi. Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, no, I'm very interested in the report and it was extremely informative, but I just wanted to make a point that the distribution generation behind the meter, you mentioned hybrid models, which would include battery energy storage, and that's the field that we're in. Now, the trouble with that is that the perception out there is that energy storage, battery energy storage, is for large grid scale, and that any projects that we've seen tend to be plus 20 megawatt, and therefore I think smaller organisations, when I say smaller, the likes of hospitals or you know, large energy users in the C&I space aren't particularly aware of how to go about the route to market for a battery energy storage system, even though it is available, the technology's there, and as Tomas said, I think that the price is going down rapidly. But we're seeing lots of stories on the press and on, you know, LinkedIn and so on about these super duper systems, and I think that perception needs to change. We sort of can't keep up, to be honest, with the inquiries that are coming through from our customers, but they're really astounded to hear that there is a battery storage system that is between 0 and say 15-20 megawatt available, and that it can be put on the system now. So it seems that it's great news that what you're saying in terms of the report is aligned with what now needs to happen with these C&I customers that want the opportunity to, you know, have their own management of energy going forward.
Yeah, and we're certainly a number of other projects outside of this report, you know, working and seeing an increased appetite from, you know, corporates and factories of bringing battery storage and the benefits it can bring. So, you know, we see it as a firm component of the energy mix now and going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So thanks very much for your report.
Thanks, Alison.
Okay. I think there was only one other question from Tomas, and it was on planning. So hopefully we've covered that. Tomas, feel free to come in if you feel it hasn't been covered. So I suppose a final call. Any last questions? Okay. Well, I'll maybe just move to my wind up then, if participants are content. So, as we've discussed, extending context for difference is probably the single biggest policy intervention in terms of bringing forward the next wave of renewables, including, we hope, of distributed scale of that sub 5 megawatt scale. We are the only parts of these islands without some form of support mechanism, and I suppose it's right to say that RenewableNI is working with the Department for Economy in making sure if and when we do extend contracts for difference, it's made to work for Northern Ireland. We will have differences from the GB market, the longer planning times I've mentioned, maybe typically smaller projects as well at the minute, higher grid connection costs. So ensuring that if we do introduce a competitive market, then indeed NI projects can compete. And whether or not that's by introducing, say, as with RES, there was RES in the south, there were minimum limits for things like solar. We could, for example, have within a CFD minimum ring fence capacity, I suppose, for NI projects to ensure that what our consumers pay for does result in generation in Northern Ireland. So we're having those conversations with the Department for Economy, with BEIS, the UK Government Department, and others to ensure that not only the CFD is extended, but it is made to work, and also looking at other options. So RenewableNI produced a report, Power of Renewables, with AFRY Consulting, which looked at the different options. So extending CFD came out as, I suppose, as the top option because the legislation's already in place to do that. It's an existing workable system, but there are other options if for any reason the extension of CFD can't be made to work. And I suppose looking at our proposed 80 by 30 target and the benefits it'll bring, I suppose some of what we're talking about are the challenges, but it would see over £1 billion of new private investment. And I mentioned we're working with KPMG. That figure's maybe a back of the envelope calculation by me, but we're working with KPMG to produce a report really detailing the level of investment and the job opportunities of getting to 80% renewables, and what it'll mean for our local economy. I mentioned before our Achieving Zero report, and it comes in two phases. Phase 1 takes us up to 80% and shows that achieving that milestone will result in about a 75% reduction in CO2 emissions from where we are today. And then the second phase of the report sort of looks at how we go from that to a fully zero carbon system. So I advise you to check that out on the RenewableNI website. It also has the video recording of our webinar on the Achieving Zero report. So please check it out. And finally, I'd point you to our Smart Energy Conference. At the conference, we'll be launching the economic report with KPMG. You'll get to hear Russel again. We'll have the Minister open the conference as well. We would be expecting there to have been a publication of an energy strategy by this stage. So, it'll certainly be an early chance for the Minister to outline his vision for the energy sector, in terms of full decarbonisation of energy, but also the department's own targets for 2030. We'll see how much of what RenewableNI has asked for is in the final strategy. So please join us on the 2nd of November for the Smart Energy Conference, and registration is open now on our website. So that's it for me, other than to thank you for your attendance and for your questions, and to thank Russel and Tomas for an excellent report and presentation, and Judith, our comms and events manager, for making today happen and making sure the technology worked, and indeed that I wasn't on silent when I started my presentation. So thanks everyone, and have a good rest of the day. Thank you.